Thank you very much, Dirk. This talk is apropos to absolutely nothing of our business. So if you feel compelled to put your head down and take a little nap, I will not be at all offended. Let me start out by telling you that I am an American by invitation and I am an American by choice. I'm very proud of the fact that this great nation invited me and my family to come and become part of it. And I have an eternal amount of gratitude to this absolutely great nation. Let me take you back to a point of demarcation in my life, which is August the 11th, 1960. August the 11th, 1960 is the day that my family and I left Cuba and came to the United States. And it was about 7:30 in the morning where we were standing in front of our home. We lived in the suburbs of Havana. It was a two-story house. It was not opulent, but it was very comfortable in a very nice neighborhood. And we stood there looking at our home and watching my dad lock the front door to the house. My older brother, Orlando, was 12 years old at the time. I was 11. My sister, Grace, was 7. And so my mom and dad and the 3 kids took a moment to look at it because we were about to leave our home and go to the port, go to the docks, Havana Harbor, to board a ferry boat that ran from Havana to Key West to come to the United States. And it was at that point that morning, the feelings that we had, my mom and dad felt that we would probably be out of Cuba for about 6 months, at the outside 1 year. A sufficient amount of time for political conditions in Cuba to be straightened out so that we could return to our home and return to our homeland. Obviously, we were sadly mistaken. It's been over 44 years. My mom and dad passed away here in the United States. They're both buried in Miami. And since 1960, none of us, the 5 of us, have ever set foot back in that house, in that home, or for that matter, in the island of Cuba. But I will tell you that I am planning on going back. It is now a marathon race between Fidel Castro and me. Fidel is 77, I'm 55. I don't smoke. I'm trying to drink with moderation. Patty's put me on a diet. And so, with a little luck, maybe with a good amount of luck, I'll be able to outlast him and outlive him. And I do plan to go back. On that morning, I had very mixed feelings about that day and what was about to happen. There was a great deal of excitement because we were going to the great colossal, the United States, that we knew so much about. The American culture was ingrained in the Cuban culture. Heck, we had a Cocker Spaniel by the name of Hopalong Cassidy. We couldn't even pronounce his name, but there was also a great deal of trepidation. And there was trepidation because we were going from a country where we spoke the language to one that we did not. We were going from a country where we knew the customs and the habits to one where the customs and habits in America are different, and let's face it, you Americans are peculiar. And we found out early on. And then we were moving from a situation where we were in the majority, most everybody was like us, to a situation we were in a distinct minority. By language, by culture, by background, by even religion. But I will tell you that each and every one of us will profit if at least once or twice in our lives we are part of a minority. Because when you're part of a minority, it teaches you understanding, it teaches you tolerance, and it teaches you forbearance. Let me give you a quick example of that. When we left Cuba, Cuba was upwards of 90% a Roman Catholic nation. I mean, everybody just believed the same way. The Catholic Church is the mother church. If you want to go to heaven, you better be a Catholic. And I remember as a 7-year-old riding in the car with my dad, and my dad pointing out an oddity, a Protestant church in the suburbs of Havana. And my mind just reeled. What? They have a church here? We know where they are? Shouldn't we do something about them? I mean, everybody knew that the Protestants were devil worshippers. You guys were aligned with Satan. But now I came to the United States and started school, started class, and lo and behold, the majority of the kids were Protestants, and they did not have forked tails or horns on their heads. And so you realize that there are different, but it's not a pejorative connotation. They're no better, they're no worse. They're just different and they're people. When it comes to language, I am a big believer in immersion. You throw somebody in the milieu where they have to learn it. I didn't speak a word of English. Neither did my brother, my sister, or my dad. My mom had studied and lived in Manhattan for 2 years during her junior high schooling years, and she knew English. But the three of us basically did not. But I believe that if you put somebody in a situation where they must, then they shall. They shall learn it. We arrived here about 3 weeks before school started, and just the getting to know the kids in the neighborhood and every day having to play with them and try to communicate increased our ability to learn and to master English rapidly. Next door to us lived a boy and a girl. The girl was just my age, 11 years old. And just the effort of going and trying to communicate with these two kids, I'd come home just sweaty and exhausted and tired, but every day it was getting easier and better when it came to the language. In fact, I remember, and one of the big demarcation points in learning a language is the first time you dream in that language. And I remember dreaming in English and waking up the next morning and going, wow, that was cool. Everyone in the dream was speaking Spanish, and I mean English, and I in the dream was speaking English also. The dream was also about the little girl next door, but I don't believe it would be appropriate for me to share that part of it. Let me tell you that as difficult as the bumps and bruises in learning a language, the customs, the differences between one culture where something is acceptable, right and proper, and another one that is not, is almost as daunting. There was a young man who came from Cuba at the same time, and I met in school. And by the way, Arturo Oyo and I go back to elementary school in Key Biscayne when we first arrived. But there was a young man that came who was having the same problems that I did in terms of learning the language and navigating through it all, but he had an additional problem. His name was Jesus Ramirez. Now let me tell you, Jesus Ramirez in English is Jesus. Jesus Ramirez. And I got to tell you that while it's absolutely right and proper in the Hispanic culture to name your kids Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, and in fact, the more saints you add to the name of the child, the better the child will be. It's absolutely a belief. In the United States, it's kind of awkward. You all don't believe in naming your kids after God. It's just not done. So poor Jesus Ramirez, every time he introduced himself to somebody, they kind of gave him a funny look. I mean, you can imagine he's sent to the principal's office. Teacher comes by and says, "Do you know what I caught Jesus doing today?" Really doesn't work well in this country. But I'll tell you what the epiphany was. The epiphany for my brother Orlando and I about learning this culture was when we started getting interested in girls and the whole dating pattern. And we realized that in America, girls don't go out on a date with a chaperone. You see, in Cuba, when you took a girl out on a date, the mom came along. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we all know that you can't trust boys alone with girls on a date. In Cuba, we did something about it. Over here, you all kind of look at it and you go, oh, that's okay. But Orlando and I realized that here in the United States, that's not the custom. So beyond just a very simple interrogation when you come and meet mom and dad, and they want to make sure that you're not the Boston Strangler or a mass murderer, they turn their daughters over to you. And Orlando and I are just really excited about this. And that a blouse that left the house at 7 o'clock nicely buttoned on the front and was returned at 11 o'clock at night with the buttons on the back and not every button matching was really not cause for World War III. At that point, Orlando and I realized that this is a tremendous country and that we needed to do whatever it took to acclimate ourselves to it. And from that point, from that perspective, we've never looked back. Let me at this point change gears and get very serious with you, because I do want to talk about Cuba, and I want to share with you some information and some thoughts as to what happened to Cuba and what has happened in the last 45 years. First of all, let me start by giving you a very basic primer, and because you are Floridians, many of you already know this, but let me give you a very brief primer on Cuba. Cuba is a tropical island, 92 miles south of Key West. If you board a jet plane in Havana, in Miami, and you fly to Havana, you're landing in half an hour. Less time than it took everybody here to get from Miami to Orlando. Half an hour, you are there. But it is ever so far for so many of us. Cuba is about the size of the state of Pennsylvania, or compared to our own state of Florida, Cuba is about 3/4 of the size of Florida. But a much more interesting topography. We have real mountains. You know, the mountains in Florida are, 300 feet above sea level? It's a little bump on the road someplace right outside of Orlando. Cuba, or rather Florida, has a population of 16 million. Cuba has 12 million. But in addition to those 12 million in Cuba, in the island, there's an additional 2 million that have left, part of the Cuban diaspora, scattered throughout the world. And I would submit to you that if we open the doors in Cuba and they could leave, fully half of the population would be gone. Fully half of the population would leave. Of that 2 million that are outside of Cuba, probably about 1.5 million are in the United States, and probably 1.2 million are in the Mecca, Dade County, and a few sprinkled up to Broward County. On January the 1st, 1959, January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro, who was at the time 32 years of age, Raul Castro, his brother, who was 27 years of age, and Che Guevara, who was 30 at the time, with a group of men of about 300 to 400 men, overthrew a military dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista had been in power for 7 years, and he in turn had overthrown a democratically elected government. We had a constitution and constitutional guarantees. He set him aside, named himself president, and ruled for 7 years. On that January 1, 1959, the overwhelming majority of Cubans were in favor of Fidel Castro. Except for those that were aligned with Batista regime, most of us were in support of Fidel Castro because he promised to return Cuba to a democratic process. We were going to have free election, constitutional guarantees were going to be reestablished. And as every one of us know, it was a lie. It was a very, very cruel lie. By 1961, Fidel Castro declared that Cuba was a Marxist, Leninist, communist, socialist island, that Cuba was anti-imperialist, and the anti-imperialism was directly aimed at the United States. You must understand, in any considerations of negotiations with Fidel Castro, that Fidel Castro has a visceral dislike and envy for the United States. He also declared that Cuba was an atheist nation, that there was no room for God in the new socialist island of Cuba. And by any measure, by any standard, by any ruler that we look at, it has been a dismal failure. Whether you're looking at the economy, political democratic institutions, individual freedoms, freedom of religion, it's been an absolute failure. Let me give you just a few little facts related to that. The Heritage Foundation every year ranks the economic well-being of every nation in the planet. In the year 2003, they declared that Cuba was number 155 out of 156 nations in the globe. Only North Korea had a weaker economy than Cuba. In the year 2004, just a couple of months ago, the Heritage Foundation improved the ranking to about 144, because Venezuela and the president of Venezuela, who's Hugo Chavez, who's a big fan of Fidel Castro, is practically giving Cuba free petroleum. Great discount, and Cuba doesn't pay. Let me tell you how they dismantled the economy in Cuba. In 1960, on May 17, 1960, they passed a law called the Agrarian Reform Law. And what it basically says is any farms or ranches that are bigger than a certain size will be taken away from private ownership and given to the government. And with a stroke of a pen, 85% of all the agricultural lands in Cuba passed from private hands to the government. 85%. The Gomezes, my family, I am Alex Soto-Gomez. In the Spanish tradition, we never forget about mom. You always carry in your name the last name of your father. I am Alex, the son of Mr. Soto and Miss Gomez. The Gomezes on my maternal side were in agriculture. Actually arrived in Cuba in the year 1511, about 110 years before the Pilgrims got to Plymouth Rock. Settled in the interior of the island and went into agriculture. 450 years later, with a stroke of a pen, on May 17th, 1960, we were out of business. We were no longer raising cattle. Later on that year, on October 13th, 1960, the first one is May, in October 1960, they passed what they call the Urban Reform. And the Urban Reform basically took all of the means of production, all of the factories, all of the businesses, and either confiscated them outright or put them under the control of the government. My grandfather, Antonio Soto, on my father's side of the family, was the son of an immigrant, a Spanish immigrant who was born in 1882, and because the family had bad economic conditions, started to work at the age of 15. He would work during the day and go to school at night, and he pushed a cart down the street where he sold vegetables and he sold fruit. And that went very well for him, and he bought another one, and then he bought a little piece of land and a little business here. And by the time he was in his late 70s, in 1959, he was a self-made man. He was a mortgage lender. He had owned an insurance company, he had owned a bank, he was a roof tiling company, he was a home builder and a land developer, and a number of other things. And with a stroke of a pen, on that October date of 1960, it was all taken away. That same month, he boarded a plane to Miami, and 2 years later, he died, having lost everything that he had built and worked for an entire lifetime. Last couple of things I want to tell you about the Cuban economy is, interestingly enough, the budget in Cuba is only $13 billion. Heck, the gross domestic product of Cuba is $18 billion. The Cuban business owned in Miami, Cuban-American businesses in Miami, have a gross domestic product of $26 billion. Cubans in Miami, $26 billion. The entire island of Cuba, $18. And it is not because the Cubans in Miami are smarter or harder workers. It's simply because in the United States there's opportunity. In Cuba there is none. The lessons of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, that a man and a woman will work harder for themselves and for their family than they will for the government, is a lesson that most everybody in the world understands, but in Cuba they haven't quite gotten it yet. Finally, the last thing I'll tell you in the economy is that the Cuban foreign debt, remember, a budget of $13 billion, Cuban foreign debt is $33 to $36 billion, and they're not paying it. And what they want to do is they want to trade with the United States on credit. They want you guys to subsidize the trade. And if they're not paying the Chinese, they're not paying the Russians, they're not paying the Paris Club, they're not paying the Latin Americans, I can assure you that the last people that they're going to pay is going to be the Americans, because they just simply don't like you. In 1962, they did away with a free press. They confiscated 16 newspapers, 18 radio stations, and 4 TV stations. They just shut him down and then created a few papers that are propaganda. Sam and Mary Margaret Rogers were in Cuba on a religious mission not too long ago. Sam was telling me 2 nights ago he was reading one of their newspapers, a grandma, full of lies about our government, about our nation, and about our president. Fortunately, a number of people in Cuba see through that, but it's a propaganda mechanism. Let me tell you that Cuba operates under the whim of one man, Fidel Castro. They've got all the structures of government. They've got a General Assembly. They've got a one party, the Communist Party, but it's all about Fidel Castro. About a year ago, I get a call out of nowhere for me from a man named Dr. Emilio Adolfo Rivero. Dr. Rivero is a professor of political science and language in the Washington, D.C. area, and he tells me over this phone call that he would like to meet, he'd like for us to get to know each other, and he has a story that he must share with me. So last November 2003, I was in Washington on Big I business, and so I took the opportunity to have lunch with Dr. Rivero, and he tells me the story that he had been a political prisoner for 18 years in Cuba for being opposed to Fidel Castro. But interestingly enough, he had fought with Fidel Castro, and very quickly after Fidel Castro's triumph, he turned, he changed. And I said, what caused you to do that? He said, well, I realized that we traded a bad dictator for an awful one, and that we made a huge mistake in taking up with Fidel Castro. He said, you remember, there was a trial of 31 pilots from the Batista regime that were being tried for bombing the rebels in the mountains during the struggle. And so they were being tried, and they substantiated to the court that they dropped the bombs away from the rebels, so the court acquitted them. Fidel Castro got on TV and on the radio, and he gave a 3-hour harangue speech indicating that revolutionary justice demanded another verdict. And with that, the 31 pilots were rearrested, retried, this time convicted, and this time received sentences from 20 to 30 years in prison. At that point, Dr. Rivero changed. But the anecdote that he wanted to share with me most poignantly was that he was picked up by the secret police in Cuba, the G2. And the G2, when they caught him, took him to some safe houses that they had for interrogation. And they kept him there for a 31-day period where he was upstairs, and then they would drag him down and interrogate him every day and threaten him with execution. And they were going to do him in unless he gave up everybody that he was working with. And one day, when he is in his cell, he is looking through the crack on a little peephole that they had established to keep an eye on him. And there's a guard sitting outside his door looking at a photographic album. And Dr. Rivero surmises that that must be the album of the family that had lived there. And he spots a picture of my grandfather. And he recognizes a picture of Miguel Mariano Gomez because my grandfather had the good fortune of having served as president of Cuba in the 30s. So he surmises that he's in the house of a Gomez. Ladies and gentlemen, he was in our home. Our home for 45 years has been a place of interrogation, intimidation, torture, and in some cases, execution. And that is very heavy on my heart, that a home that gave us so much pleasure is now used in this manner. In Cuba, God is dead. They're now reviving him a little bit. They're allowing some interaction between American churches and Cuban churches, but they're watching it. They want to make sure that Sam doesn't misbehave. And if it ever becomes a problem, I can assure you they'll shut it down. In 1961, they expelled 100 priests, first the foreign-born, then the natives. For the first 3 years of the revolution, they coerced another 460 religious, rabbis, ministers, Jesuits, priests, just to get out of the island. And they basically said, you can practice your religion, but if you do, you cannot join the Communist Party, and nothing happens in getting ahead in Cuba if you're not a member of the Communist Party. You also might as well forget about going to college. You're not going to be admitted into the University of Havana, and you will not be able to work for the government. So if you want to practice your religion, you better be ready to have somebody in your family take care of you and support you. Pete Cabrera, who is, or was until recently, the assistant principal in Patty's school, told me a story that happened to him when he was in kindergarten in Cuba that I have heard, quite frankly, repeated many times in Miami. Pete was in class in kindergarten, and the teacher said, "Today we're going to talk about God, the revolution, and Fidel." He said, "Kids, put your head down, and let's pray to God for a piece of candy." Raised their heads, and there was no candy on the desk. "Kids, put your head down, and let's pray to the revolution and to Fidel for a piece of candy." And lo and behold, candy appeared on every desk. You see, kids, you must understand that Fidel and the revolution will take care of you. God will not take care of you. Pete Cabrera went home, told Mom what had happened, and Mom freaked out, moving heaven and earth to try to get Pete out of the island. And that was happening in the early 60s all across Cuba, and gave birth to an operation called Operation Peter Pan. Operation Peter Pan lasted only 2 years, and 14,000 Cuban kids were smuggled out of the island. And they were smuggled with the help of 3 groups. One, the United States State Department. The State Department started issuing something called visa waivers. Shipped them to Cuba in the hundreds. Number 2 were a group of Cubans who got the visas and distributed them. And that group of Cubans paid dearly, because once the operation was discovered in 1962, they went to jail for a long, long time. Most of their lives in prison to pay for that action. And the third group was the Catholic Church in Miami. Monsignor Bryan would go every day to the airport with a group of people waiting for the plane from Cuba and just watching to see if there were any children that were unaccompanied that he needed and the church needed to take. And in those 2 years, 14,000 kids got out, and they were put in foster homes, in orphanages, in institutions in 35 states of this nation. Elsa Bergola, who is the law firm administrator of one of my clients, tells me that she was 9 years old, her brother was 5, and they received visa waivers. And her mom and dad took Elsa and her little brother to the airport 3 days in a row, looking for somebody that had a kind face, so that mom and dad could turn over the kids to that person with a kind face. On the 3rd day, they found 2 middle-aged women, and they turned the kids over, and Elsa said, "I rode in the lap of one, and my 5-year-old brother rode in the lap, sat on the lap of the other lady." And Elsa is one of the fortunate ones, because she had an aunt that was waiting at the airport to pick her up. But 14,000 kids came with nobody here waiting for them except for the Catholic Church. And if you pause a second as a parent or a grandparent and think about how desperate you would have to be in order to turn your kids over, not knowing when you would see them again. Some of those kids were reunited within 6 months, within a year, within 2 years. Others never saw their parents again. Their parents died in Cuba. They were in prison. The last kids from Peter Pan operation to get out of an institution in the United States got out in 1976. So they were institutionalized from 62, which is when the program ended, to 1976. Cuba operates under total control. Everybody is encouraged to keep an eye on everybody else. One of the ways they do it is they have committees for the defense of the revolution. And the committees for the defense of a revolution are organized all the way down to the block level. There is a captain and there's a lieutenant. And it is the job of the captain and the lieutenant to know the business of everybody in our block. They want to know where you work, what your political inclinations are, where you drink, what your vices are. And whenever somebody arrives in the neighborhood that doesn't belong, they make it their business to find out who they are. When the buses arrive to pick up people to go to the plaza to listen to Fidel Castro, they make sure that you get on the bus. And they keep tabs. Because if you don't cooperate, if you don't participate, the day you want to improve your job or the day you want to get a little better apartment, because nothing is bought and sold, it is provided by the government to you. If you've been a good communist, if you've been a good party member, if you've been a good communist, then they will let you have the apartment. Otherwise, they will not. Let me share a story about total control. In the middle 80s, Patty and I had a young man hanging some curtains in our house. And by the language pattern, I realized that this was a young man that arrived from Cuba not too long before. And so typical of us Cuban Americans is to kind of get grounded with each other. What's your story and what's my story and how did you come over? And this is what he told me. He said, well, I was a member of the Pioneers, which is the communist youth movement in Cuba, and was on my way to join the Communist Party, and I loved the Cuban Revolution. In fact, my father was in prison, and I would go argue against my dad and say, Dad, the revolution is for all Cubans. You got to change. But you know, interestingly enough, as he got a little older, as he got into 15 and 16 and 17, he started to change. But he had no one he trusted with his new feelings. So he'd go to the woods, and he said he'd argue against himself. He'd take one side and then the other and just have an argument, not telling everybody that he was changing. Right about this same time, he had a girlfriend, a young lady that he was madly in love with. And eventually they became engaged, and they were going to get married. And he would go over to her house, and her father was a colonel in the army. And there were pictures of Fidel and Raul on the walls, and they would go how great the revolution was, this and that, and he just kept his mouth shut. One day he gets word that he's being sent to Moscow to study for 2 years or 4 years. This guy has now changed. He's about 18 or 19, but he doesn't know how to get out of it. So to the airport they go. She's crying. Her family's there. His family is there. Everybody's crying. They're engaged. He promises he's going to come back. They're going to get married. He doesn't even know if he's going to go in 2 or 4 years. Plane takes off, stops in Madrid to refuel. He sneaks out of the plane and hides. He hides for about 3.5 hours. In the meantime, they're looking for him. They can't wait any longer. The plane takes off and goes on to Moscow, and now he's in Madrid. He asks for political exile. It is granted. And somehow, because I don't remember that part of the story, somehow within 7 months, he's at the Mecca. He's in Miami, like the rest of us. So now he's in Miami, and he is going to put his life together, and he's going to figure, I got to learn English, and I'm going to do something with myself. And so he starts going to the Miami-Dade Community College. And he is attending Miami-Dade Community College and getting ahead. And one day he comes out of class, and he walks out of class and makes a turn down the hallway. And as he makes a one turn, who does he run into but his fiancée? He and this girl have not spoken a word, written a letter, or had any communication in over a year. And they are stunned. They are seeing each other for the first time in that period of time, and so they stumble over to one of those concrete benches that they have at all the colleges, and kids are coming by, and they're having a quiet conversation. And she goes, "What happened to you? You went to Moscow, you were going to study, and then come back, and we were going to get married." And he says, "I couldn't take it anymore. I literally had to escape. I had to get away." And he goes, "But what about you? Your father was a colonel in the military. Every time I come over to your house, it would be Fidel to the right and Fidel to the left and Raul and this and that." And she goes, "Oh, we never believed that either. But we pretended because of you. We pretended because of you." And if you stop there a second and you think about it, here's a couple A young couple who is madly in love, who are engaged to get married, who are having intimate relations. And even in that most quiet and private time between a man and a woman, pillow talk, neither one of them feels confident enough, safe enough to say to the other one, you know, sweetheart, I don't believe this. I am sorry, but I do not believe this. I asked him whether they repaired the relationship, and he said no. Unfortunately, we realized that we had lived a lie to each other, and too much had happened to each of our lives separately for us to get back together again. So we hugged and we kissed and we wished each other well, and she went her way and I went my way. Very sad tale, but it underscores control, which is what happens in Cuba to a great extent. Let me close by making some comments on the embargo and the future of Cuba. I believe that the embargo should stay if that helps bring change to Cuba. We do away with the embargo if that helps expedite bringing change to Cuba. It reminds me of a letter that I read not too long ago by Abraham Lincoln. He wrote a man called Horace Greeley, who was the publisher of the New York Tribune. And Greeley was an abolitionist. And this was during the dark days of the Civil War. And Lincoln said to Greeley, my interest in this struggle is the preservation of the United States, is the preservation of this country. And you should understand that I will free all of the slaves if that helps preserve the nation, or I will keep all of the slaves in bondage if that accomplishes that, or I will free some of the slaves and keep some in bondage, which is precisely what he did, by the way, if that's what helps the cause. So that's the way I feel about the embargo. But my analysis is this. I don't think we ought to be trading with Cuba for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago. I don't think we ought to be going as tourists and leaving money in Cuba. And I, for one, will not until there is change. 10 days ago, Raul Castro, the brother of Fidel and head of the army, declared that now the tourist industry is under total control of the army. It's been moving in this direction since January. And now the tourist industry joins the sugar industry, the construction industry, and the import and export industries as being all under the control of the army. And you've got to ask yourself, why would the army be interested in running tourism? And there are two reasons. One is control. You want to keep an eye on the American tourists and the European tourists. You want to take them to the resorts where Cubans are not allowed to go. You want to take them to the restaurants and the hotels that native Cubans are not allowed to go, and if they were allowed, they can't afford to be there anyway. And I think, and the second reason is money. If they get the revenues, if they get the profits, that will strengthen the military, the militia, and the committees for the defense of the revolution. And when change comes, and change will come, I am sure of that. But when change comes, and whether it comes in the form of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which will be moderate, or whether it will come in the way it happened in Romania, with the Ceausescus being alive one day and the next day being dragged through the streets, I don't know. But I suspect change will start coming when Fidel Castro dies in his bed of old age. And when he does, the Cuban people there will hopefully start to then say, enough. Enough suffering. Enough of this. And there is no one else to take up the mantle that has the charisma of a Fidel Castro. When that occurs, I hope, fondest hope in my heart is Patty and I will have a home in Cuba. Will I turn my back on the United States? No, of course not. I am an American. I've been here 45 years. I love this country with every fiber in my body. My kids are Americans. But I can see ourselves having a second home, not unlike those of you who have beach houses or houses in the mountains in North Carolina. Remember, 30 minutes, Miami, Havana. And so I truly, truly look for the day that each of you can come and visit us in Cuba, a free Cuba. Thank you.